My coworker gave my abusive ex my new address. Now, strange things keep happening at night. The first thing I noticed was the car. A dark green Subaru Forester parked across the street from my apartment at 11:40 p.m. on a Wednesday, in a spot that was almost always empty because it was directly under a broken streetlight that the city had been promising to fix for 3 months. I noticed it because I always do a last check of the street before I lock up for the night, a habit I developed over the 18 months I spent with Garrett Nwosu, when checking exits and scanning for his car became as automatic as brushing my teeth. I had been free of that habit for 7 months. I thought I was free of that habit for 7 months. Then I saw the Subaru and the habit returned completely, like it had never left, because habits built on fear don't actually go away. They wait. The car was gone the next morning. I told myself it meant nothing. I made coffee and went to work and sat across from my coworker, Petra Lindqvist, at the shared desk space we had occupied for 2 years. And I told myself that a parked car under a broken streetlight was just a parked car and that I was not going to let 7 months of careful reconstruction be undone by a vehicle that probably belonged to someone visiting the building next door. I had been living in the new apartment for 7 months when things started happening. 7 months since I had packed my car with what I could carry and driven to a city 2 hours away and started over in the specific methodical way of a person who understood that starting over required more than new geography. It required new patterns, new routines, new points of contact, and most importantly, new information security about where you were and what your life looked like. I was a 31-year-old medical records administrator, careful by professional training, and I had applied that carefulness to my escape from Garrett the way I applied it to patient privacy compliance, systematically, with documentation, with attention to who had access to what. My family knew the city, but not the specific address. My closest friend Thandiwe knew both, but had given me a specific promise and had kept it. My employer, I had taken a remote position with the same company where I had worked in person, which allowed me to transfer without explaining everything. Knew my address for payroll purposes, which meant it sat in the HR database with whatever security protocols the company applied to that data. And Petra Lindqvist knew because Petra Lindqvist was my work friend, my lunch text friend, my send you a meme at 3 p.m. friend, and I had made the specific error of trusting a person because I liked her rather than because I had examined whether she was trustworthy. These are different things. I understand the difference now. Garrett Nwosu was 35, a gym manager, which was relevant because it meant he had a specific relationship with physical presence and with the projection of control that I had initially misread as confidence and had slowly, over 18 months, understood was something else entirely. He was not the kind of abuser who left marks. He was the kind who understood exactly how much pressure a person could endure without anything documentable, who understood that the most effective control operated through the person's own psychology rather than through external force. He had made me feel, by increments, that my judgment was unreliable, that my memory was faulty, that the things I experienced were not the things that had occurred. The night I left, which was not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of 17 months of accumulation, landing on one specific Wednesday evening when he did something that I will not describe here because it is mine and I am not required to give it away. I drove 2 hours to the city I had chosen because I had researched it, because it had good public transit and a decent hospital system and an advocacy organization for domestic violence survivors that I had found online at 2 a.m. 6 weeks before I actually left. I had planned the leaving. Planning was the only thing I had fully trusted myself with by that point. Petra had known about Garrett because I had told her, carefully and incompletely, in the way you tell coworkers enough to explain behavior without giving them the full map. She knew I had left a difficult relationship and relocated. She knew I was not in contact with my ex. She did not know what kind of difficult the relationship had been, which I now understand was information she used to calibrate how serious the address disclosure was when Garrett reached her. He was good at that, at finding the fulcrum point in someone's understanding and applying exactly the right pressure. He would have called her with something plausible, something that made giving him the address feel like a reasonable or even kind thing to do. I learned later, through a process I will describe, exactly what he said to her. It was elegant, and I am angry at myself for being almost impressed. The second thing was a photograph. I found it on Monday morning, slipped under my apartment door, a printed photograph of my building entrance taken from across the street, time-stamped in the image. I could see the timestamp in the corner, 11:52 p.m. that Saturday, with nothing written on it. Just the photograph, the building entrance, my building, taken while I was inside it at nearly midnight. I stood in my hallway holding it and felt the specific sensation that Garrett had trained into me over 18 months, which was the sensation of being watched by someone who wanted me to know I was being watched. That was his technique. Not confrontation, but observation. Not contact, but presence. The message was always the same. I know where you are. I am always going to know where you are. I took a photograph of the photograph with my phone, put the original in a Ziploc bag because I had learned about fingerprints from a podcast I had listened to during the months of planning, and I called the police non-emergency line. The officer who took my report was patient, but matter-of-fact. He asked if I had a restraining order. I did not. I had left without filing one because the filing process required a known address, and I had been afraid of what Garrett would do when he discovered where I had moved. The officer said there was not much they could do about a photograph slipped under a door. He gave me a case number. I wrote it down. It was the first entry in the log I started keeping that day. I called the advocacy organization the following morning. Their name was Horizon Path Domestic Violence Services, and the person who answered was a woman who introduced herself as Camille, and when I told her what was happening, she said, "I need you to write down everything you can remember from the last week, with times and dates." She said it in the tone of someone who had heard this before and knew exactly what it meant. She was not dismissive, and she was not alarmed. She was functional, which was what I needed. She connected me within the day with a victim advocate named Rosalind Okonkwo, who had 14 years of experience specifically in stalking and technology-facilitated harassment cases. And Rosalind called me that afternoon and walked me through the process of building what she called a stalking documentation package, a formal, structured record of every incident, cross-referenced with any available evidence, presented in a format that law enforcement and courts could work with. She said, "The photograph under the door is significant." She said, "Whoever took it wanted you to find it. That is an escalation of contact rather than passive surveillance." I wrote this down. I had been writing things down since Monday, and I did not intend to stop. The third thing happened on a Thursday. I had taken to checking my car every morning, a necessary and exhausting ritual that Rosalind had recommended as a precaution, and that I resented needing to perform. On Thursday morning, I found a single white flower tucked under my windshield wiper. Not from a florist, a wildflower, the kind that grew along roadsides, with a stem that had been snapped rather than cut. It was not romantic. It was not meant to be. It was Garrett's language, the same language he had spoken in the small gestures of our relationship, gifts that were not quite normal, gestures that were slightly off in ways you couldn't easily articulate, but that accumulated into a feeling of wrongness. I had learned to read this language over 18 months. I was reading it now. I photographed the flower in position before I touched it, then placed it in a fresh Ziploc bag and added it to the evidence folder I was building in a banker's box under my bed. I texted Rosalind. She said to bring it in. She said the documentation was building quickly, and that we were close to having enough for a formal restraining order application. I said, "How close?" She said, "Another incident or two." I sat with the knowledge that another incident or two meant another incident or two had to occur first. Then Dewey came to stay with me that weekend. She lived 3 hours away and came on the train with a bag and 2 bottles of wine that we did not open because I did not want to be impaired, and she understood why. She slept in my bed, and I slept on the couch, and at 2:47 a.m. on Saturday, I woke to a sound that I could not immediately identify and lay very still in the dark with my heart doing the specific thing it did in those circumstances, which was beating very fast and very quietly as if volume management would help. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scraping along the exterior wall of my apartment, about 6 inches above the ground, running from the living room window toward the front door. It lasted approximately 12 seconds and then stopped. I lay still for 2 minutes. It did not recur. I reached for my phone and turned on the voice recorder. I'd been sleeping with this ready since Monday, and I held it and did not move, and listened to the silence of my apartment and the slightly less silent street outside, and I thought about Garrett's patience, which had been one of his defining qualities, his willingness to let time do work, and I thought about the Subaru under the broken streetlight on that first Wednesday, and the photograph and the flower and the shape that these things made together. In the morning, I found the scrape on the exterior wall, a mark in the paint about 2 feet long, consistent with something sharp being drawn deliberately along the surface. I photographed it from multiple angles. I added it to the box. I made an appointment with a family law attorney on Monday. Her name was Adaiz Ibo, 17 years in family and protective law with a specialization in domestic violence protective orders. And her office was clean and direct, and she spent the first 15 minutes reviewing my documentation before she said anything. Then she said, "This is well prepared." She said it in the tone of someone who had seen poorly prepared cases and was relieved to encounter the alternative. She said, "I want to file the protective order application this week." She said, "I also want to report the address disclosure to your employer's HR department and have them investigate how your contact information was obtained. Because if a coworker provided your address to someone you were hiding from, that is potentially a violation of your employment contract and possibly of privacy statutes depending on how the information was accessed." She emailed me a list of what she needed. I had most of it in the banker's box. I drove to her office on Wednesday and handed her a folder organized by date and category that Rosalind had helped me structure, and she held it for a moment, and then she said, "Did you prepare this yourself?" I said, "With help?" She said, "This is going to be useful." I confronted Petra the next day. I want to be precise about why I did this before the formal process is completed rather than after, because there is a case for waiting, and I chose not to make it. I chose not to wait because I needed to know. I needed to understand the specific mechanism of the betrayal, what Garrett had said to her, what she had understood about what she was doing, whether she had asked herself at any point why my ex was looking for me, rather than whether I wanted to be found. I sat across from her at the shared desk space where we had worked together for 2 years, and I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She looked at me with the expression of someone who already knows what they are about to be asked. I said, "Did you give Garrett my address?" She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "He said he had something of yours. He said he just wanted to return it. He said you'd changed your phone and he couldn't reach you." I said, "I changed my phone because I didn't want him to be able to reach me." She said, "I didn't know it was like that." I said, "I told you I left a difficult relationship and relocated." She said, "I thought difficult meant bad breakup." I said, "I need you to understand that difficult meant I left in the middle of the night." I watched her face go through several things. I said, "I need you to tell this to HR and the police." She said, in trouble?" I said, "I don't know yet." The HR investigation moved faster than I expected, which was partly because Adiz had sent a formal letter before I had my conversation with Petra, which meant HR was already activated by the time Petra's account arrived. The HR director, a man named Jerome Bhattacharya, who had been in the role for 9 years, and who wore the expression of someone for whom this was not the most difficult situation they had handled, but was certainly in the top 10, met with me, and then with Petra separately, and then requested the company's IT security logs to determine how Petra had accessed my home address. The logs showed she had accessed my personnel file through the employee directory portal on a date that corresponded to the week before the Subaru appeared under the broken streetlight. She had no legitimate reason to access my personnel file. The policy on that was clear, and she had been trained on it. Jerome said, "We are initiating a formal disciplinary process." He said, "I want to be transparent with you that the outcome of that process is not something I can discuss, but I want you to know that we take this seriously." I said, "I need to know it is documented." He said, "It will be documented." The protective order application was heard 8 days after Adiz filed it. The hearing was in front of a judge named the Honorable Fatima Azikiwe, who read through the documentation package with the focused attention of someone who had decided from the first page that this case was worth her full attention and who asked Adaiz 2 clarifying questions, and me 3. My 3 questions were, where did the incidents occur? When did they start? And did you have any direct contact with the respondent during this period? The answers were, my property and vehicle, 5 weeks ago, and no. Judge Azikiwe looked at the scrape photograph and at the flower photograph and at the printout of the case report from the non-emergency line and at the timeline Rosalind had helped me build. And then she granted a 3-year protective order. Garrett was required to stay 500 feet away from my home, my workplace, and my vehicle, and to have no direct or indirect contact with me. The order was served to him that afternoon. I received confirmation at 4:15 p.m. and sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and held my phone and felt the specific physical sensation of something being held that had been held at tension for a very long time and then releasing, which is different from relaxing. Releasing means it was there and now it is not. Relaxing means it was never entirely held. I had been holding this for 5 weeks. It released. I sat in the car for 22 minutes before I drove home. The crisis I had been building toward arrived 6 days later, which is what happens when you think the formal resolution is the end and the situation has not finished escalating. I came home on a Monday evening to find my apartment door unlocked. Not broken, unlocked. I stood in the hallway holding my keys, and the door was half an inch open, and the specific quality of the air coming through the gap was wrong. Not smell exactly, but something close to it. The presence of recent occupation. I did not go in. I went to my neighbor across the hall, a retired teacher named Mrs. Agbula, who had lived in the building for 20 years, and who had become aware, in the preceding weeks, of the situation without me having told her all of it, because she was perceptive and neighborly in the precise combination that means she noticed things and cared about what she noticed. She let me in, and I called 911 from her apartment at 6:17 p.m. 2 officers arrived within 9 minutes. They cleared my apartment and found no one inside, but found evidence of entry. A window latch in the bedroom that had been manipulated, a drawer in my kitchen that was slightly out of position, and a Samsung Galaxy phone on my counter that did not belong to me. The officers photographed everything. They called it in as a break-in with a potential tracking device left on premise. I told them about the protective order. One of the officers said, "We need to get Detective Osei on this." Detective Emmanuel Osei had been in the Crimes Against Persons unit for 11 years and had a specific familiarity with stalking cases that showed in the way he talked about what the phone on my counter meant. He said, "This is called technological surveillance." He said, "Leaving a device is a method of tracking location through the device's Bluetooth or Wi-Fi signals rather than GPS. Less obvious, less easily detected." He said, "The protective order violation is the most actionable element right now, combined with the break-in." He said, "I want you to understand that we can move on this immediately." He had me call Edays while he was still in my apartment, and Edays answered on the second ring. And the 3 of us had a conversation that covered the next 12 hours efficiently. The violation of the protective order was a criminal matter that Detective Osei could act on without waiting for a civil process. He had enough to request an arrest warrant by the following morning, based on the break-in, the phone, and the documented stalking pattern preceding it. He said, "Is there anything you haven't told me?" I said, "The coworker who gave him my address." He said, "I want that on record too." Garrett was arrested at 9:45 a.m. on Wednesday at his gym in front of his morning staff and a handful of early members. I know this because Detective Osei called me and told me, and because Thandiwe, who had been monitoring the situation from 3 hours away, through the specific sustained attention of a friend who had decided this was her situation too, found a Facebook post from someone who had been at the gym that morning and had recorded part of the arrest on their phone. The post described a gym manager being handcuffed and led out by 2 officers while the morning spin class sat in confused silence. Thandiwe sent me the link at 10:22 a.m. with a message that said, "It's real." I sat with my phone and the coffee I had made and thought about the photograph under the door and the flower under the windshield wiper and the scrape along the exterior wall and the phone left on my counter, and I thought about Petra's face when she said, "I thought difficult meant bad breakup." And I thought about the 18 months before I left and the 7 months of careful reconstruction after. And I thought about Detective Osei saying we can move on this immediately, and about Judge Azikiwe reading the documentation package with full attention, and about Adazi saying this is well prepared. All of it had been necessary. None of it should have been. The criminal charges were filed formally 3 days after the arrest: breaking and entering, violation of a protective order, criminal stalking, and installation of a surveillance device. Adazi said the combination was strong. She said, "His attorney is going to look at the documentation package you built and advise him to consider a plea." She was right. The plea negotiation took 6 weeks and resulted in a conviction on 3 of the 4 counts, with a sentence that included 18 months of probation, mandatory enrollment in a batterer's intervention program, and a permanent 5-year extension of the protective order. It was not prison. I want to be honest about the fact that it was not prison. It was also not nothing, and it was on record, and it had his name attached to it permanently, which meant that the next woman who looked him up, and there would be a next woman, because people like Garrett always found the next woman, would find this. That mattered to me. I would not be the last woman who was documented about, but I would be the one who made the documentation exist. Petra was dismissed from her position 3 weeks after the HR investigation concluded. The findings were that she had accessed confidential personnel information without authorization and disclosed it to a third party in violation of company policy, employee privacy agreements, and applicable data protection statutes. Jerome Bhattacharya communicated this to me through a formal letter that used the language of HR process and said nothing about the consequences of what she had done in the specific human terms I might have chosen. I did not need the letter to use those terms. I had lived them. I saved the letter in the banker's box with everything else, because the banker's box had become something other than an evidence collection at this point. It had become the physical record of a period I intended to understand fully, rather than minimize or bury. Some people told me afterward to put it away. I understand why they said it, and I understand why I did not. I moved apartments 3 months after the arrest. Not because I needed to. The protective order, the conviction, the distance Garrett was required to maintain all meant the immediate threat was substantially reduced, but because the specific walls and the specific sounds of the specific floor under my feet had become associated with the scraping and the photograph and the unlocked door, in a way that I was not willing to manage every evening for an indeterminate future. The new apartment was slightly smaller and slightly further from my preferred grocery store, and had better light in the morning, which I had not known I needed until it was there. Rosalind helped me with the safety assessment of the new place. Mrs. Agbula gave me a plant when I left, a small succulent in a terracotta pot, and said she was glad it had turned out the way it had. I brought the banker's box with me. I keep it in my closet now. Not under the bed. Moving it felt like an accurate recalibration of what it represented. Not something to be hidden, not something to be displayed, but something filed, something organized and real and finished. The thing about building a life after something like this is that the building is not linear. I know this because Rosalind told me early on, and because Dr. Ifeoma Chukwu, the therapist I began working with 4 months after everything concluded, has been methodical about helping me understand the specific ways that nonlinear progress actually works. How the alarm response that fires when a car parks under a streetlight is not a failure of healing, but the body being accurate about its history, and how the work is not to silence the alarm, but to develop the capacity to evaluate its accuracy rather than be governed by it. I have been working on this. It is slow. It is also the correct work. The banker's box is in my closet. The succulent is on my windowsill. Thandiwe visits every 6 weeks. Detective Osi sent me a text message on the day the plea was finalized that said simply, "Well done. I kept it." He said no one would believe me. Garrett did not say this out loud, but his behavior said it. The photograph under the door, the flower, the phone on my counter, all of it premised on the assumption that what I experienced could not be made to hold. He was wrong about that. The documentation held. I said no one would believe me. And now the record of what happened belongs to anyone who needs it.